Hi, everyone. Just a little bit of recap of where we left off before our break. We are now in the social psychology part of our class, and we left off looking at how social psychology ties into gender. So, when we look at the social psychological foundations of gender, we're looking at how we learn and we internalize our gendered culture. So, we learn meanings of masculinity, meanings of femininity, and once we internalize those meanings, they surface in our personal and social identities, and they surface in our beliefs about who we are as men and women and who others are based on their sex. So, when we started to discuss the social psychology of gender, we did the gender identification activity. And that activity basically shows us that we don't only gender people, but we gender other things such as our taste, our hobbies, jobs. But we also talked about some things are considered to be gender neutral. And by gender neutral, we don't associate that specific thing with men or women, but rather we associate it with people. So, as an example, we can think of a hoodie in terms of a piece of dress. We don't think of hoodies as being specifically for one sex or the other, but hoodies are for people to wear. Likewise, if you think of a college student, in the past, the college student would have been gendered as male, but today we see college students as being gender neutral. Women can be a college student just as easily as men. So now we can turn our attention to the McLean article. And here we see gendered social psychology and how it can relate to the production of inequality between the sexes. So if you think back to the activity that we did last class, looking at how we gender different hobbies and we gender different tastes, it was kind of innocent. It was almost a fun activity to really start to reveal, how we gender people, how we gender things. But here, it's a much more serious look at gender social psychology and how it can produce what I call a false inequality between men and women. And by a false inequality, it's an inequality that's created between the sexes, not based upon merit, anything that's real or anything that's legitimate, but rather than inequality based upon merit, it's inequality based upon what we think men are, what we think women are, and how those gender beliefs can lead to illegitimate inequality between the sexes. So specifically, when looking at gender social psychology, McLean is looking at gender beliefs. So how we see other people not as people, but as women and men, and use ideas of masculinity and femininity to see who these people are, perhaps who they are not. So the article gets at what we call gendered voice. And by gendered voice, we don't hear ideas, we don't hear comments from people as ideas or comments. We see them as ideas and comments that are coming from the mouth of a man or the voice of a woman. So that's what we mean when we're talking about gendered voice. And then the research wanted to look at, does gendered voice influence performance outcomes? So, in other words, when you're in a group, when you're in a team, speaking up and using a certain type of voice, does that lead to increased status in the group? Does it lead to increased chance of becoming a leader in the group? And in addition to the type of voice being used, does it matter if it's a female or a male saying it? So here we can start to break down the research. They wanted to look at how the speaker is perceived, and the two main variables in the research are voice type and the sex of the speaker. So the voice type can be broken down into promotive voice, and promotive voice is when you are advancing the teamwork, you're advancing the group work, you're moving things forward, you want to get closer to the end. And prohibitive voice type is a voice type where you want to slow things down a little bit. Not exactly kind of moving forward, but slowing the group down, slowing the team down, and sometimes kind of rethinking what you're doing and maybe change things rather than simply moving forward. So in addition to the variable of voice type, the other variable they're looking at is the sex of the speaker. So is the speaker a male or a female? And so together they look at how voice type can lead to benefits in group work, benefits in teamwork, and those benefits are getting higher social status in the group. So here people recognize you as somebody who is competent, and with this kind of recognition of competence, you're going to emerge as a group leader, as a team leader. And they look at how both voice type and sex kind of relate to those benefits, getting higher social status when you do speak up and emerging as a group leader with that higher social status. So now we can take a closer look at the research to see if voice type matters in terms of being prohibitive or promotive when using your voice. And does that matter to achieve higher status, thus becoming a leader in the group? And also we'll look at if gender matters. So if you're male or female and you're using one voice type or the other, do you still get the same status recognition? Do you still become a group leader no matter if you're a male or if you're female? So when looking at the hypothesis 1A, they suggest that using promotive voice, the voice that leads to kind of advancing the group and moving forward, they believe that promotive voice will positively relate to gaining social status in the group. So the more you're speaking up, the more you're trying to move the group forward, the more status other group members will give you. And they supported this thesis. The research did back this up. So when you are speaking up and when you're using that promotive voice, you're more likely to gain the status from your fellow group members. Now, when looking at hypothesis 1B, they suggested that prohibitive voice, the voice that's about kind of caution, it's about slowing things down in a group, they believe that also would relate to gaining status. So if you try to, make people think twice and maybe, think back a little bit rather than simply moving forward all the time, they believed that people would give you higher status in the group as well. But they did not find support for that. So when people did speak up, but they spoke up using the prohibitive voice, trying to kind of slow things down, stop and think about things, fellow group members did not give those people a higher social status. And so when moving to hypotheses 2 and 3, they're looking at how using one voice or the other leads to gaining status in the group and eventually becoming a leader. So the first, hypotheses 1A and 1B looked at, does the voice type matter when it comes to getting status? And it does matter, as we just talked about. Only the promotive voice led to people getting higher status in the group when they spoke up. Now they're looking at, in hypotheses 2 and 3, does using the voice and getting the status ultimately make you a leader in the group? And hypothesis 2 looked at the promotive voice type, and they did find support for their hypothesis. Basically, they found that when you do get status by using your promotive voice, you're likely to emerge as a leader in your group. You're likely to emerge as a leader in your team setting. Hypothesis 3 looked at this relationship, but looking at prohibitive voice, and they did not find support for this. And it makes sense because if people don't give you higher status when you're using the prohibitive voice, you're not going to emerge as a leader as a result. So again, we can stop here before we get to hypotheses 4 and 5 and say basically what they found so far in the research, that the type of voice you use matters. You're more likely to get the status, you're more likely to emerge as a leader in a group when you're only using that promotive voice rather than using the prohibitive voice. And so now, in the next two hypotheses, they're looking at gender as a variable. So it doesn't matter if the person doing the speaking is a male or is a female. So I'll jump down to hypothesis 5 first, because this was not supported. And it makes sense that it didn't matter if you're a man or a woman when you use the prohibitive voice, because using the prohibitive voice doesn't give anybody higher status, and thus you're not going to become a leader as a result. So hypothesis 5, we can kind of ignore that, because now we can look at the promotive voice that does lead to higher status, that does lead to people becoming group leaders. And so the hypothesis 4 says, okay, if you're using this promotive voice trying to move the group forward, do you still get the same status? Do you still get the same leadership if you're male or if you're female? And their hypothesis that they believe that men would benefit more from using the promotive voice was supported. In other words, they found that women who are speaking up using that promotive voice are not getting the same amount of status. They're not getting the same leader emergence compared to men. So this is kind of the key part when looking at gender social psychology and the production of false inequality. The women doing the same thing as the men, speaking up and trying to move the group forward, are not getting recognized in the same positive light that men are. So doing the exact same activity, using your voice, trying to move the group forward, men are getting more benefits compared to women. Men are getting status. Women are not getting status when they're using the same type of voice. And as a result, men are becoming leaders in the groups and women are not. So the inequality that is being produced is not based upon any type of merit, but rather is based upon gendered ideas, ideas that men are more competent compared to women, ideas that men are better leaders compared to women. Switching our attention to the Newman article, we're switching attention to the subtopic of leisure. So we're looking at social psychology of leisure, and specifically looking at the connection between happiness and leisure activities. So how does leisure create positive feelings in people? How does leisure make us happy individuals? So when looking at this relationship between leisure and happiness, basically we're looking at the idea that some leisure activities provide us more happiness compared to other leisure activities. So Newman is looking at this relationship. So what is it about a certain leisure activity that makes us happier compared to other leisure activities that perhaps make us not so happy? So previous research, when looking at leisure and happiness, the research defines leisure differently. So it's tough to compare and generalize findings of research when people are not using the same definitions, when people are not using the same measurements in terms of defining and measuring leisure and how it connects to happiness. So due to the different uses of measurement, due to the different definitions used to conceptualize leisure, it's tough to compare research together. So that gets into Newman's main goal of creating a operational definition of leisure, a definition that all researchers can use to both define and measure leisure in future research. So when you have this operational definition being used by all researchers, then it makes it much easier to generalize research findings. So that's one main goal of the Newman article, is to create that operational definition. And another goal is to look at what produces positive leisure experiences. So what is it about a leisure experience that leads to feeling better, that creates a happier people? So when looking at leisure, Newman believes that leisure is comprised of two different elements: a structural element and a subjective element. So when we look at the structural element of leisure, we're talking about kind of the quantity of it, how much you're doing, how long you're doing it. And then in comparison, when looking at the subjective elements of leisure, we're looking at one's personal understanding of the leisure activity. So how you subjectively evaluate the activity that you're doing. Is it something that you're enjoying or something that you are not enjoying? And again, that's in comparison to the structural element of leisure, which is more about how long or how often you're doing the activity. Now, when looking at how leisure connects to positive experiences, how leisure promotes well-being in people, making people feel happy, they look at 5 different attributes. And so on the slide, you'll see the description of the 5 attributes and basically how they promote positive experiences, how they promote personal well-being. So the first one we'll look at is detachment recovery. Detachment recovery basically looks at how the leisure activity is getting you away from your work, your occupation. So basically, how far removed are you from the work that you do when you're doing the leisure activity? So an example could be that you're going out to dinner with friends versus you're going out to dinner with coworkers. So maybe you're not on the job, but you're still hanging out with coworkers, not getting away from work fully. So here the idea is the more removed you are from your work, the more satisfaction you get from the leisure activity. So basically, you want to become detached from your work, kind of turn your work life off for a little bit and really embrace the leisure. And in doing so, you're removing yourself from work and getting more positive experiences from the leisure activities. So now we can look at autonomy as another attribute that connects leisure and positive experiences. Autonomy basically is how much freedom you have, how much control you have in terms of doing the leisure activity. So you get to choose what you're doing rather than somebody choosing it for you. And you basically can do the leisure activity the way you want to do it versus somebody kind of telling you what you need to be doing and how you need to be doing it. So when looking at autonomy, the finding is the more choice you have, the more satisfaction you get from the leisure activity. And again, this makes sense. If somebody else chooses the leisure activity, it may be something that you maybe don't enjoy doing too much. So when the person gets to choose their own leisure activity, they're going to be choosing something that they enjoy. So basically, the more say, the more freedom you have in the leisure activity, the more satisfaction you're going to be getting from the leisure. So the third attribute we can look at is mastery. And here is basically when you're doing the activity, are you in control of what you're doing? Are you doing it well? And basically, let's say that the leisure activity is a video game. you would have mastery here if you know how to play the video game and you know how to play it well. Versus there'd be a lack of mastery if you're playing a video game for the first time. You wouldn't really know how to play it. You wouldn't know kind of what to do, what not to do. So you would lack control in that situation. So the finding basically is, the more mastery you have, the more in control you are of the leisure activity, rather than kind of feeling out of control. The more control you have, the more satisfaction you're getting from that leisure. So we can move down to meaning as the fourth attribute, looking at how leisure connects to positive experiences. Meaning basically says that you have some type of personal connection to the activity that you're doing. Or if there's a lack of meaning, you don't have any real connection to what you're doing. So, for example, I grew up going to the horse races a lot with my family. And so over time, I developed a strong kind of relationship with going to horse races, horse racing in general. And so it has a very strong meaning to me. It's special to me. Compared to my wife, for example, who didn't grow up around horse racing, never really went through horse races, she really doesn't have that special meaning attached to the leisure activity. So when we go to the races, my wife and I get a more positive experience out of it. It makes me happier compared to her because she kind of lacks that special meaning to the races that I possess that helps me really get some satisfaction out of horse racing. So finally, we can look at affiliation as being the last attribute. And so here, affiliation is if you're doing the activity individually by yourself, or if you're doing it socially with other people. And so what they find is social activities produce more leisure satisfaction compared to when you do the activities individually. So again, this is the pattern that you find that more often we're happier when we're around other people doing the leisure activities compared to if we do the activities by ourselves. And I say again, it's the pattern because some people are more introverted. Some people would maybe enjoy doing things individually rather than in groups. So we can see sometimes there'll be exceptions. But for the most part, the findings show us that we do get more happiness out of leisure activities when we're doing those activities with other people. Now we can go back to how Newman conceptualizes, how Newman defines leisure as being two parts. One part subjective, one's personal understanding of the leisure activity, and one part structural, how long you're doing the activity in terms of time, how often you're doing it in terms of frequency. So kind of the quantity as the structural element and kind of the quality, the personal understanding of the leisure as the subjective element. So when looking at the two in reference to one another, they find that it's the subjective feelings of the leisure activity that outweigh the time elements. So the quality that's defined by the individual kind of outweighs the time you're doing it or how often you're doing it. So the subjective elements of leisure outweigh the structural elements of leisure when it comes to positive results, satisfaction from the leisure activity. So this makes sense in terms of if you define it as being really important to you, then you're going to get the happiness out of the activity. While on the other hand, if somebody's doing the same type of activity, but they don't enjoy doing it, then they're not going to get the same kind of positive results from doing the activity. So overall, that's kind of running through the main ideas in the Newman article and running through the ideas closely in reference to the 7th in-class assignment that connects to this article. The last question in the in-class assignment, I'm asking you to kind of look at the relationship between culture and social psychology. because we talked about if our culture doesn't define leisure as being important for us, often we internalize that cultural message and we don't see it as being important as well. Although, research shows that leisure is very important for happiness. Often, when we focus so much on work, 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 we organize our lives around work and kind of marginalize leisure life as a result. So, the connection between culture and social psychology is what that last question is getting at. So, I'll leave that there for now, and I'll be back soon with another uh, presentation connected to the next two readings.